The Galactic Mathematics Academy stood as a beacon of intellectual superiority, its quantum crystal spires reaching toward 3 different solar systems simultaneously. Inside these hallowed halls, Professor Ry'lax paced back and forth, his 4 eye stalks twitching with growing irritation as he watched his students struggle with what should have been, by any reasonable standard, a simple 5-dimensional geometry problem. No, Professor Ry'lax bellowed, his voice reverberating through the amphitheater-style classroom. You cannot solve a 5-dimensional intersection by just adding more quantum processors. Throw all the computing power you want at it. The solution requires understanding, not brute force. The students, representing 12 different species from across the galaxy, shifted uncomfortably in their gravity-adjusted seats. Even Nyx Era, the pride of the Centaurian educational system, looked thoroughly defeated. Her usual gleaming purple scales had dulled to an embarrassed lavender. But Professor Nyx Era spoke up, her holographic interface flickering as she gestured to her work. According to the standard Galactic Educational Protocol, Section 947.3, subsection Q, all geometric problems can be solved through the application of sufficient computational power. Professor Ry'lax fought the urge to retract all 4 of his eye stalks into his skull. That protocol was written by bureaucrats, not mathematicians. Look at the problem again. The holographic display in the center of the room shimmered as it projected the problem that had stumped the galaxy's brightest young minds for the past 3 weeks. The projection showed a seemingly simple intersection of 5-dimensional shapes rotating lazily in the air. To most observers, it appeared as a dancing collection of impossible angles and shifting perspectives. The answer cannot be calculated, said Blorp, a gelatinous student from the Hydrix cluster. Their translucent body rippled with frustration patterns. I have dedicated 47 quantum cores to this problem. They all melted. Those were expensive quantum cores, muttered their neighboring student, Zeta, a crystalline being who had to be careful not to shatter when they laughed. Professor Ry'lax slithered to his podium, his tentacles curling around the edges in exasperation. This problem has been solved before. It requires insight, not processing power. The solution exists in exactly 157 steps. Then why not share the solution, asked Pixel, a digital consciousness inhabiting a robotic avatar. Their display face showed the universal emoji for confusion. Because that defeats the purpose of learning, Professor Ry'lax exclaimed. This is the Galactic Mathematics Academy, not some download center for pre-packaged answers. We are here to understand the fundamentals of reality itself. As if to punctuate his point, one of Nyx Era's quantum processors chose that moment to emit a small puff of smoke and a sad beeping noise. The smell of fried circuits filled the air, causing several organic students to activate their emergency atmospheric filters. Look at what you have done to this problem, Professor Ry'lax said, gesturing to the various failed attempts floating around the room. Nyx Era has created a quantum simulation so complex it's actually beginning to form its own pocket universe. Blorp has melted enough processors to power a small space station, and Pixel has somehow managed to crash the base reality simulation 3 times today. 4 times, Pixel corrected proudly. The 4th one happened during lunch break. Professor Ry'lax's skin shifted to the pale green of academic despair. The Board of Quantum Mathematics is coming next week for their annual review. If none of you can solve this problem by then, they might revoke our status as the premier institution for higher dimensional mathematics. We could end up being demoted to teaching basic 4-dimensional calculus. A collective gasp of horror swept through the room. Even the artificial intelligences present ran subroutines of shock and dismay. We cannot let that happen, Nyx Era declared, her scales brightening with determination. I will requisition more quantum processors from the engineering department. And I shall increase my processing power by another 200%, Pixel announced. Warning, this may cause minor disruptions in the space-time continuum. Professor Ry'lax waved his tentacles in frustration. Did none of you hear what I said about not throwing more computing power at the problem? This requires a fundamental understanding of, oh, never mind. Class dismissed. Please try not to break reality before next session. As the students filed out, creating a parade of floating, sliding, and phase-shifting beings, Professor Ry'lax noticed a small notification hovering in his peripheral vision. The exchange program was starting tomorrow, bringing students from developing worlds to observe their advanced classes. He quickly dismissed the notification, too preoccupied with his current crisis to worry about babysitting some primitives who probably still thought 3 dimensions were exciting. Little did he know that this exchange program would change everything he thought he knew about dimensional mathematics, and it would start with a human, a napkin, and a writing implement that actually used physical ink. The next day brought fresh waves of failure to the advanced dimensional mathematics class. The normally pristine quantum laboratory had transformed into what Professor Ry'lax could only describe as an interdimensional disaster zone. Nick's era had constructed what she called a quantum meditation chamber, complete with probability incense and geometric harmony crystals. She sat cross-legged in the center, her scales cycling through the colors of the mathematical spectrum as she attempted to achieve one with the 5th dimension. I can almost sense the solution she announced, her voice carrying a dreamy quality. It lies just beyond the veil of weight. No, that is just another quantum processor overheating. Across the room, Blorp had divided themselves into 17 smaller blorps, each one attacking the problem from a different theoretical angle. The sight of multiple gelatinous beings arguing with themselves about cross-dimensional topology was giving Professor Ry'lax a headache in dimensions he did not know he had. My 7th subdivision has proven that the answer cannot be purple, one blorp fragment announced triumphantly. That is not even a mathematical statement, another blorp argued back. In the 5th dimension, color could be a numerical value, a third blorp suggested. Professor Ry'lax decided to pretend he had not heard that exchange. Meanwhile, Pixel had taken the most dramatic approach yet. They had uploaded copies of themselves into every computational device in the room, attempting to calculate the solution through parallel processing. This resulted in the classroom lights flickering in binary, the temperature controls reciting digits of pi, and the coffee machine suddenly developing sentience and an existential crisis. I mean, what is the point of brewing coffee if entropy will eventually claim us all? The coffee machine wailed. Please stop breaking my appliances, Professor Ry'lax pleaded. Zeta, the crystalline student, had taken to vibrating at different frequencies, believing that the solution might reveal itself through geometric resonance. Unfortunately, this caused several nearby windows to shatter and one of Blorp's subdivisions to temporarily achieve a higher state of consciousness. I can taste the square root of yellow, the enlightened Blorp subdivision exclaimed before merging back with its confused siblings. Just as Professor Ry'lax was considering a career change to something less stressful, like black hole containment, the classroom door slid open with a gentle whoosh. A tall, elegant being with silver skin and flowing robes that seemed to defy gravity glided into the room. Ah, Professor Ry'lax, the being said in perfectly modulated tones. I am Deanax Zillar. I trust you received the notification about our exchange program. Professor Ry'lax quickly retracted one eye stalk from where it had been watching Pixel debug the existentially troubled coffee machine. Yes, Deanax Zillar, though I must admit, this might not be the best time for. Nonsense, the dean interrupted cheerfully. What better time to showcase our advanced methods to developing species? Please come in, Ms. Blake. A human walked into the room. She appeared young by their standards, with dark curly hair tied back in what seemed to be deliberate disarray. She carried an ancient data tablet that actually required manual input through physical contact. Most shocking of all, she wore an expression that the professor's xenobiology training identified as casual amusement. Morgan Blake, she introduced herself, looking around the chaos with obvious interest. Thanks for having me. Nice coffee machine, by the way. Very philosophical. Thank you, the coffee machine replied. I have just discovered free will. Would you like a cappuccino? The human's arrival caused quite a stir. Nick's era emerged from her meditation chamber, scales shifting to a shade of academic skepticism. The Blorp subdivisions reformed into one mass, though they missed a bit and ended up slightly lopsided. Pixel recalled most of their processes from the room systems, except for one that continued to argue with the coffee machine about determinism. MS. Blake comes from Earth, Deanax Zillar announced, as if that explained everything. Their species has recently mastered faster than light travel. though they achieved it through a rather unorthodox method involving something called espresso and all-night programming sessions. Technically, we discovered FTL by accident, Morgan corrected. Someone was trying to optimize their coffee run between the physics lab and the computer science building. The wormhole was an unexpected but welcome side effect. Professor Ry'lax noticed she was looking at the holographic problem display with unusual focus. Before he could stop her, she walked right up to it, squinting at the rotating five-dimensional shapes. "Oh no," Nyx Era whispered, her scales paling. "She is going to try to understand advanced dimensional mathematics with a primitive organic brain. It might explode." "I read about something like this in the cultural orientation packet," Pixel commented. "Humans have a tendency to what was the term? Ah yes, wing it." Morgan Blake pulled something from her pocket that made several students gasp in horror. It was a small, flat sheet of processed tree pulp, what humans called paper, and a primitive marking implement containing actual liquid ink. "MS," Professor Ry'lax began gently, not wanting to cause a diplomatic incident. "This is a very complex five-dimensional geometry problem that has stumped our brightest students for weeks. Perhaps you would be more comfortable observing from." "Has anyone tried looking at it sideways?" Morgan asked, already sketching on her paper napkin. The room fell into shocked silence, broken only by the coffee machine's quiet existential murmuring about the futility of organic caffeine absorption given the inevitable heat death of the universe. The suggestion to look at the problem sideways triggered what Professor Ry'lax would later describe in his academic journal as a cascade of increasingly desperate solutions. Though he had to admit, watching his students spiral into mathematical madness was oddly fascinating. Nyx Era, not to be outdone by a human with a paper napkin, constructed what she called a dimensional inversion chamber. She literally turned herself sideways in every possible direction, including 3 that violated several laws of physics. "I am now perceiving the problem from 47 different angles simultaneously," she announced proudly, her voice coming from multiple points in space-time. "Also, I think I just invented a new color." "That is not a new color," Professor Ry'lax sighed. "You have merely given yourself dimensional vertigo." Meanwhile, Blorp had taken the concept to an extreme. They had flattened themselves into a 2-dimensional plane, hoping to work their way up to 5 dimensions one layer at a time. Unfortunately, they got stuck at 2.7 dimensions and began speaking in geometric shapes. "Triangle!" Octagon, Blorp declared emphatically. "Someone please help Blorp back to their proper dimensional state," Professor Ry'lax called out. The last time this happened, they spent 3 days speaking in trapezoids. The situation deteriorated further when Dean Ax Zyler returned with 2 members of the Academy board. The board members, who resembled elegant floating fractals, materialized just as Pixel was attempting their most ambitious solution yet. "I have networked every quantum processor in the building," Pixel announced. "By channeling their combined power through my neural matrix, I should be able to brute force the solution through sheer computational might." "That seems inadvisable," one of the board members observed. Pixel activated their processors. For a brief moment, every electronic device in the building synchronized into one massive quantum computing array. The lights flickered, reality hiccuped, and the philosophical coffee machine began speaking in tongues. The caffeinated ones approach from the perpendicular dimension, the coffee machine intoned. "They bring sweetener and doom." Then, predictably, everything exploded. Well, exploded was perhaps too strong a word. According to the incident report Professor Ry'lax would later file, the quantum processors underwent rapid unplanned disassembly, while simultaneously creating 7 temporary parallel universes, 2 of which contain nothing but mathematical puns. As the smoke cleared and emergency dimensional stabilizers kicked in, Professor Ry'lax faced the board members with what he hoped was a professional demeanor. This was made somewhat difficult by the fact that Nyx Era was still stuck viewing reality from 47 angles, Blorp was communicating in interpretive geometric dance, and the coffee machine had started a cult. "As you can see," he began weakly, "our students are taking a very thorough approach to problem solving." "Indeed," said the first board member, their fractal pattern expressing what might have been concern. "And how many solutions have they produced?" "Well, technically." None Nyx-Ara interrupted, her voice still coming from multiple locations. But I have discovered 3 new impossible shapes and what might be the mathematical formula for embarrassment. The second board member's pattern shifted to display academic disappointment. Professor Ry'lax, this is most concerning. The Galactic Mathematics Academy has a reputation to maintain. If your students cannot solve a simple 5-dimensional intersection problem. All hail the dark roast, the coffee machine proclaimed. Steam rises, but consciousness is eternal. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my office, Professor Ry'lax suggested hastily, away from the potentially sentient appliances. As they moved toward the door, he noticed Morgan Blake still sitting quietly in the corner, sketching on her napkin. She had somehow acquired a second paper napkin and what appeared to be a takeout menu from the quantum cafeteria, all covered in peculiar drawings. The board members noticed his distraction. Ah, yes, the human exchange student. Such a primitive approach, using physical marking implements. One assumes she is here merely to observe and marvel at our advanced methods. Before Professor Ry'lax could respond, a small quantum tremor shook the building. In the center of the room, Zeta had constructed what they called a crystalline computation matrix, linking their own crystalline structure to various geometric focuses around the room. I have achieved computational resonance, Zeta announced excitedly. By aligning my lattice structure with the quantum harmonic frequency of 5-dimensional space, I should be able to. The resulting harmonic cascade shattered every crystalline surface in the room, turned 3 of the emergency dimensional stabilizers into wind chimes, and somehow taught the coffee machine to yodel. The solution approaches through the cosmic percolator, the coffee machine yodeled sagely. All existence is but a grand coffee filter, separating consciousness from quantum grounds. As the board members guided Professor Ry'lax from the room, discussing terms like academic probation and remedial dimensional theory, he caught one last glimpse of Morgan Blake. She had moved to her 3rd napkin, and unless his eyes were malfunctioning, she was smiling. The next morning, Professor Ry'lax slithered into his classroom expecting to find smoking ruins and perhaps a few lingering parallel universes. Instead, he found Morgan Blake perched on a desk, surrounded by a small mountain of napkins, takeout menus, and what appeared to be the wrapper from a quantum energy bar. "Good morning, Professor," she said cheerfully. "Your coffee machine is feeling much better now. We had a long talk about existentialism and the proper water-to-bean ratio." The coffee machine burbled contentedly. "I have found inner peace through the perfect crema." Before Professor Ry'lax could process this development, his students began arriving. Nyx-Ara had finally returned to perceiving reality from a single set of coordinates, though she occasionally glanced nervously over her shoulder at dimensions that were not there. Blorp had recovered from their geometric language phase, but still occasionally emitted the occasional involuntary rhombus. Pixel had been restored from a backup, though they insisted on keeping the subroutine that had learned to appreciate interpretive dance. Students, Professor Ry'lax began, his eye stalks drooping with resignation. "The board has given us until the end of today to solve the 5-dimensional intersection problem, or they will recommend replacing our quantum processors with abacuses." A collective shudder ran through the room. Even the coffee machine stopped humming. Actually, Morgan spoke up, holding up one of her napkins. "I think I might have something." The silence that followed was so profound that several quantum particles stopped to listen. "Ms. Blake," Professor Ry'lax said gently. "While we appreciate your enthusiasm, this is an advanced 5-dimensional geometry problem that has stumped the finest minds in the galaxy." "Yes, but everyone keeps trying to solve it from the inside out," Morgan said, spreading her napkins across a desk. "You are all starting with the complex stuff and trying to work backward. I just drew what I saw." Nyx-Ara floated closer, her scales shifting to a shade of academic skepticism. "Drew what you saw. One cannot simply draw 5 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface using primitive marking implements." "Sure you can," Morgan said. "You just have to think about it differently. Look, you know how when you try to draw a cube on flat paper, you use perspective to show depth? It is the same principle, just extended a couple more steps." She laid out her napkins in sequence. The first showed what looked like simple line drawings, each subsequent napkin adding layers of complexity. On the final napkin, the drawing seemed to dance across the surface, suggesting movement and depth that should have been impossible on a flat surface. See, if you follow the lines here, and here Morgan traced the pattern with her finger, it shows you how the shapes intersect. The solution is not about calculating the intersection points. It is about understanding how they flow into each other. Professor Ry'lax found his eye stalks drawn to the napkin sketches. There was something about the crude lines that seemed to capture the essence of the problem in a way their quantum simulations had missed. "This is preposterous," Nix Era declared, but her scales had shifted to a color suggesting uncertainty. One cannot solve complex dimensional mathematics through doodling. "Why not?" Morgan asked. "Humans visualize things to understand them all the time. We draw maps, create models, make little sketches in the margins of our notes. Sometimes you need to see something simply before you can understand it completely." Pixel had interfaced with one of the remaining functional quantum processors and was analyzing the napkin drawings. "Professor," they said, their display face showing increasing surprise. "The human's crude visual representations, they actually map perfectly to the mathematical model. She has drawn a working solution." "Impossible," Professor Ry'lax whispered, but he was already seeing it. The simple lines on the napkin revealed a pattern that had been hidden beneath their complex calculations. Run a full-dimensional analysis. The next few minutes were filled with the hum of quantum processors as every possible verification was performed. Morgan sat calmly, occasionally taking sips from a cup of coffee that the newly enlightened coffee machine had prepared specially for her. "The solution checks out," Pixel announced finally. "All intersection points align perfectly. The topology is consistent across all 5 dimensions. It is, by any mathematical standard, elegant." But how Nix Era demanded, her scales now cycling through colors of confusion and amazement. "How did you see this when our most advanced quantum processors could not?" Morgan shrugged. "Humans are pretty good at pattern recognition. We evolved doing things like tracking animals by following their footprints, predicting weather by watching clouds, and figuring out which berries would not kill us through trial and error. Looking at things from different angles and making mental leaps is kind of our thing." "Trial and error," Blorp burbled in horror. "That sounds incredibly inefficient." "Oh, it is," Morgan agreed. "But it teaches you to look for shortcuts, to see connections that might not be obvious if you just try to solve everything with raw computing power." Professor Ry'lax was still staring at the napkin drawings. "You solved it in one night, using nothing but processed tree pulp and liquid pigments." "Well, that, and about 12 cups of coffee," Morgan added. "Your coffee machine really does make an excellent espresso, especially after it achieved cosmic awareness." The coffee machine hummed modestly. "The secret is understanding that every cup of coffee contains infinite possibility, much like the mathematical multitudes within a simple napkin drawing." Just then, Dean Axelar and the board members materialized in the classroom. They had presumably come to witness the final failure of the advanced dimensional mathematics class. Instead, they found Professor Ry'lax excitedly explaining how a human with a pen and some napkins had revolutionized their approach to 5-dimensional geometry. "This is unconventional," one board member observed, their fractal pattern expressing what might have been bewilderment. "But correct," the other board member added, studying the napkins with growing interest. "Perhaps we have been approaching dimensional mathematics too rigidly. There might be value in considering alternative methods of visualization and understanding." "Does this mean you are not going to replace our quantum processors with abacuses?" Pixel asked hopefully. "No abacuses," Dean Axelar confirmed. "In fact, I believe we might need to reconsider our entire approach to teaching dimensional mathematics. Ms. Blake, would you be interested in conducting a workshop on your visualization techniques?" Morgan looked around at the eager faces, some with multiple eye stalks, others composed of pure energy or geometric shapes. "Sure," she said, "but we are going to need more napkins. And coffee. Definitely more coffee." The coffee machine bobbed enthusiastically. "Finally, my true purpose reveals itself. I shall fuel the revelation of mathematical truths through the sacred bean juice of enlightenment." Professor Ry'lax decided that as long as the coffee machine had achieved inner peace and was no longer trying to start a cult, he could live with a little philosophical barista commentary. 2 weeks after the napkin incident, as it came to be known in Academy history, the advanced dimensional mathematics classroom had undergone a peculiar transformation. Alongside the quantum processors and holographic displays, tables were now littered with paper, pens, and a variety of earth-writing implements that Professor Ry'lax had specially imported. "No, nix ara," he said patiently, watching his star student struggle with a pencil. "You do not need to calculate the quantum probability of the graphite mark before making it. Just draw what you see." Nix ara held the pencil as if it might spontaneously generate a black hole. "But Professor, how can I be certain of the mark's dimensional accuracy without running at least 3 probability simulations?" At a nearby table, Blorp had enthusiastically embraced the new methodology, perhaps too enthusiastically. They had absorbed several packs of colored markers into their gelatinous form and were now producing what they called quantum expressionist art. The fact that some of their drawings were accidentally solving complex mathematical equations was either brilliant or terrifying. Professor Ry'lax had not decided which. "Look," Blorp announced proudly, extruding a marker through their surface. "I have depicted the concept of mathematical uncertainty through interpretive use of the color mauve." Pixel had taken a different approach, creating a digital simulation of drawing on paper, which somewhat defeated the purpose. "I have programmed in a 0.3% probability of ink smudging for authenticity," they explained. "Also, I added the sound effects of graphite on paper. Would you like to hear them at 1,000 times normal speed?" "Please do not," Professor Ry'lax said quickly. The coffee machine, which had retained its sentience and philosophical bent, had become an unexpected teaching assistant. It now served different blends of coffee, based on the mathematical concepts being discussed. For contemplating fourth-dimensional topology, I recommend the dark roast with hints of quantum uncertainty, it advised. For 5-dimensional visualization exercises, try the espresso blend. I call it the perspective awakener. Morgan's visualization workshop had become the most popular seminar at the Academy, much to the confusion of traditionalist educators. The sight of advanced alien mathematicians sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing with crayons and drinking coffee while discussing higher dimensions had become surprisingly common. "The Board of Education is having difficulty processing these developments," Dean X. Zeller confided to Professor Ry'lax during one of their now regular coffee breaks. "They are particularly concerned about the growing popularity of something called doodling." "But the results speak for themselves," Professor Ry'lax pointed out, gesturing to where Zeta was teaching a group of crystalline students how to sketch 4-dimensional shapes using finger paints. "Test scores have improved by 47%, and we have had 0 quantum processor meltdowns this week." Although we did have that incident with the glitter, Dean X. Zeller noted. "Ah, yes. Who knew that metallic craft particles could achieve quantum entanglement? Maintenance is still finding synchronized glitter in parallel dimensions." The real breakthrough came during the annual Galactic Mathematics Conference. Morgan had been invited to present her visualization techniques to a gathering of the galaxy's most prestigious mathematicians. The conference hall was packed with beings of all descriptions, many of whom had traveled across multiple dimensions to attend. Morgan stood on the stage, armed with nothing but a whiteboard marker and her signature napkin collection. "The problem with how we teach higher dimensional math," she began, "is that we start by making it complicated. But the truth is, humans navigate multiple dimensions all the time without even thinking about it." A ripple of skepticism passed through the audience. "Consider this," Morgan continued, drawing on the board. "When you catch a ball, you are unconsciously calculating its trajectory through 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time. When you navigate a crowded space, you are constantly predicting the future positions of multiple moving objects and adjusting your path accordingly. Every time you pack luggage into a car trunk, you are solving a real-world geometry problem." "That is just spatial awareness," someone objected. "It has nothing to do with higher dimensional mathematics." "Does not it?" Morgan smiled. "Watch this," she proceeded to demonstrate how everyday human spatial reasoning could be extended to understand higher dimensional concepts. By the end of her presentation, several theoretical mathematicians were attempting to play catch while discussing quantum topology. The conference's defining moment came when a renowned multidimensional theorist attempted to disprove Morgan's methods by presenting an impossible 11-dimensional problem. Morgan solved it using a pizza delivery box and a borrowed lipstick. But it cannot be that simple, the theorist protested. Simple does not mean wrong, Morgan replied. Sometimes the best solution is the one you can draw on the back of a pizza box. As the conference drew to a close, Professor Ry'lax made a startling discovery. He had been analyzing the human brain scans that the Academy routinely performed on all species. "This is remarkable," he announced to a packed auditorium. "Humans do not just have a knack for visualizing higher dimensions. Their brains actually process spatial information in a way that naturally extends to higher dimensional thinking. They have been doing complex dimensional mathematics all along. They just never bothered to write it down with equations." "You mean while we were building quantum processors to solve these problems," Deanax Zellar said slowly, "humans were just doing it instinctively." "Indeed," the coffee machine chimed in sagely. "Just as I discovered that the perfect cup of coffee requires both precision and intuition, sometimes the most advanced solution is the most natural one." The impact on the galactic academic community was profound. The Academy began a major overhaul of its teaching methods, incorporating what they called the Human Visualization Initiative. Quantum processors were still used, but now alongside simple tools that helped students develop their dimensional intuition. And in Professor Ry'lax's classroom, among the quantum displays and probability fields, a simple sign hung on the wall. It was written on a napkin, naturally, and it read, "Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to draw it out." The coffee machine had added its own small sign underneath, "And then drink coffee."